Lecture 2 today, lecture 6 of the series. We're still with anger, of course. We're going to use anger as a lens to look at arguably, the most important kind of series of events. If you don't know anything else about medieval history, there may be one thing you do know, and this should probably be it: the Crusades. The Crusades are a series of, well, what is a crusade is a good question. A series of wars, essentially, that take place. But already, if I start to define it, it breaks down. It takes place between whom? Well, Christians and non-Christians. Not always. Sometimes these are wars which take place between Christians and heretical Christians. Like, famously, there's a crusade against the Cathars in the 13th century. There's a Baltic Crusade. There's a crusade against Emperor Frederick II. So sometimes they're against one person. Generally speaking, the common language of crusades, we think of them as religious wars fought between Christians and, basically fought against Christians and Muslims. A clash which focuses on the Levant, okay? The Holy Land, as they might call it, Palestine, Jerusalem, Israel. This is kind of the classic series of crusades, but it falls apart because a few things. As I say, sometimes there are different kinds of crusades, and sometimes people call something a crusade, but really it was an act of vandalism or violence or disgrace, such as the Fourth Crusade. The one thing I'm going to say to you is that they were not considered to be crusades at the time. They were considered as pilgrimages, okay? Or people say taking the cross. I'm going to take the cross and I'm going to go and fight. I'm going to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. There will be some fighting along the way. Either way, they are central to understanding the Middle Ages. They're central to understanding what Christianity becomes in this period, from like the late 11th century onwards to the 14th century. There are multiple crusades, like 11 crusades or whatever. It depends on how you count them. They're central because, on the one hand, this is a Christian army. What is there in place of Europe in the imagination? There is no real sense of Europe as united continent. There's no sense of a European Union explicitly. What there is there's a Christendom. And increasingly there is a Christendom with a pope at its centre. And increasingly it's something like the Crusade which performs this unity. Like, is there any pan-national society, like beyond the nation, I suppose, transnational, international society in Western Europe at this time? Yes, it's Christendom. How do we know it exists? Because they fight together in these religious wars. I suppose the other thing is that we need to talk about these four. The other reason is they are obviously like really central and traumatic moments in the history of religions. This traumatic struggle between Christianity and Islam, this holy war. It's an uncomfortable topic in the sense that, at the heart of Crusades, is there something that we could call racism? Is there something that we can call colonialism? Is there something that we can call hatred? Is there anger at the heart of these episodes? So that's how we're going to explore them. But we're going to do three things, really. I hear a sigh, oh no, it's not just one, it's three. Two of these are really short, the two triangles at the edge. These will be brief. The centre of this discussion is going to be what were the Crusades. To understand the Crusades and to understand why they begin, we need to know something about violence and lordship. What has sometimes been called bastard feudalism. This process of cruel landowning and lordship that takes place, oppressive, aggression, a climate of anger and intolerance and hatred and violence, which requires some kind of peace or truce. Then we're going to ask the big question, what were the Crusades? I'm going to tell you about the First Crusade, and then I'm just going to really briefly, not even dip our toe into the Second and the Third Crusades. We're not even going to mention the Fourth Crusade, which it was the greatest act of disgusting betrayal and tragedy in Christian history, or whatever it was called by a few commentators. We're not even going to mention that, except now, where I mentioned it. And then finally, we're going to look at medieval pacifism, and that's just going to be 2 slides, so don't worry. That's when you hear me say the word pacifism, you can start packing the bags. It's all over. Okay, let's go to violence and lordship. Violence and lordship. This is the context in which we need to understand the Crusades. We need to understand religious warfare, which breaks out at the end of the 11th century. this thing called bastard feudalism. It's difficult to quantify, it's difficult to even access in the sources, but we do see glimpses of just rage, really, total rage. Glimpses of what we would, I think any measure would call unjustifiable levels of violence. We hear stories of somebody being dispossessed of their land by someone who simply wants the land, right? So you own a castle, a small castle, a Motte and Bailey castle, and I want it, and I come in, and the things that I do, as a medieval lord, are difficult to justify on any measure. We're talking about cutting the ears off of people, cutting the tongue out, and just allowing them, and even cutting the feet off sometimes, and then sending them away so that everyone knows, right, this guy's not to be messed with. Look what happened to the last guy. We're talking about things like that. It's often compared with the mafia. It can be exaggerated. It's not clear-cut. It's not a total situation where this is the only way to possess land. But I think it's described by Thomas Bisson in his book, The Crisis of the 12th Century, very well. There is a crisis. There's a crisis of order, particularly in the 11th century and into the 12th century, a crisis of order where there's not something that we might call a rule of law, which is upholding, values which are respectful of each other's property, respectful of each other's territory, respectful of each other's authority. There are battles, skirmishes, warfare. You're a knight, I'm a knight. We both have land. We fight each other because one of us wants what the other one has. This occurs increasingly in the 1100s, or the 11th century, the 1000s, to the extent that we have something called the peace of God and the truce of God. Origins a little bit earlier, but comes to a head around about the time of the First Crusade. And let's just look at this one oath made by Robert the Pious. I wonder how he got his name. Through the oath, probably, around about 1000. And this is an oath that a guy called Robert the Pious has to take because there's no other way to control him. I will not hurt a cleric or a monk if unarmed. I will not steal an ox, cow, pig, sheep, goat, ass, or a mare with colt. I will not attack a villain or villainess or servants or merchants for ransom. I will not take a mule or a horse, male or female, or a colt in pasture from any man, from the calends of March to the feast of the All Saints, unless to recover a debt. I will not burn houses or destroy them unless there is a knight inside. So that last one confuses me. So it's okay if there's a knight inside to burn a house. But you see, the point is, obviously people were burning houses just because, or just because it's collateral damage. So this kind of oath, you increasingly see descriptions of this kind of oath, that knights will behave themselves, that lords will behave themselves, that people who have power, violent power, the capability for violent power, horses, armor, weapons, siege machines, have to go easy. Stop burning down people's houses. Stop taking what isn't yours just because you can. The point becomes that the truce of God actually culminates with like a promise that you will, that on certain days of the week you won't have fights, you won't oppress people. I won't do it on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, which is absurd. I think it's a measure of just how serious this stuff was. One description, I suppose, just to focus on one concrete encounter, which takes us to the same time as the First Crusade, the Normans in England. I'm not just saying this because I'm an English chauvinist who hates the French, but when the French came, when the Normans came, there is something called oppressive lordship, which they practice in parts of England. We know it from the chronicle of someone like Orderic Vitalis, who writes a history in the middle of the 12th century. He's describing the Normans, Norman rule in England. These are they're originally Scandinavian Norsemen who come to northern France, and then they come over to England in 1066. They forcibly protected their armed men who indulged in excessive plunder and ugly rape. Not just rape, but ugly rape. I'm not sure I take the distinction here. And inflicted their anger violently on those who complained of the cruel wrongs they suffered. So this is important, right? It's a description of how lordship is functioning. How these are the people who are supposed to be in charge, supposed to be holding up the rule of law, but instead they're just hypocrites who are beating up locals and then defending anyone who commits wrongdoing if they're on their side. Okay, so this is the situation. It can be exaggerated. It doesn't mean it was just total anarchy everywhere, although it was anarchy in some places for prolonged periods of time. just after the First Crusade, in England, we have a period which we call the anarchy, in which there's no clear monarch, and it's just people's houses being burnt down, castles being destroyed. It's not until Henry II, that king who, is he the spawn of Satan? Is he a just ruler? He introduces the original writs, which mean that finally, if you're dispossessed by me, I take your land. With the original writs, you can just simply say, I appeal to the law. There should be a rule, and there is a rule now that it's called novel decision. You can appeal to justice, and you can get justice if it was unjustified, right? That only begins at the end of the 12th century. It's free for all before that, to a greater or lesser extent. It's against this backdrop that I want you to understand the violence and the anger of the First Crusade. The whole story of the First Crusade begins in France in the year 1095. The Pope, Urban II, was taking a trip beyond the Alps. Popes did not usually, at this point, go into France at all. Most popes stayed in Italy, and more specifically stayed in Rome, except when it was too hot. They went just outside the city. Popes did not bother to spread around Europe. But Urban II chose to do something of a tour in the year 1095. And at Clermont, in a site which is now apparently a car park, but at the time it was sort of a hill, and he gathered this collective together of bishops, and there were hundreds of people there, okay? Some of the most powerful landholders, but most importantly, bishops. He gathered them together in November, and he called a council. The first part of this council, right, the first thing that Urban II did, and I think we can see it in this next slide. The first thing he did was say, you've got to stop all of this anarchy and violence. And he calls for a truce. Here we go. Listen and learn. You girt about with the badge of knighthood, are arrogant with great pride. You rage against your brothers and cut each other in pieces. This is not the true soldiery of Christ, which rends asunder the sheepfold of the Redeemer. Under Jesus Christ our leader, may you instead struggle for your Jerusalem. Now this account comes in, I've written Balderic of Dul's name down here. There are many different accounts of this speech. We don't know exactly what was said. We don't even know what language it was said in. Was it all in Latin? And then that changes things. Obviously, not everyone can understand it. I assume it was probably in French vernacular, or at least translated into it, because he's addressing the knights. But anyway, that aside, you see what's happening here is a pivot. All of this energy, all this rage that you have towards your enemies here in France or wherever, I want your land, I'm angry, I feel like there's some feud. 20 years ago, your uncle took my land, now I'm going to get revenge. There's all kinds of narratives like that are going on in this late 11th century society. And Pope Urban is saying, stop it, it's not Christian. But he's not quite saying that. He's almost saying, continue that, but just direct it somewhere else. Continue, take that rage and anger and show someone else the wrath of it. This is at least the way the speech seems to pivot. In several versions of the speech, it's the same. Urban makes his first plea. There needs to be peace. There's too much fighting. There's too much warfare between Christians. And then pivots. There's a problem in Jerusalem. Jerusalem has fallen into enemy hands. It's now under Muslim rule. It was Christian. It was part of the Byzantine Empire. It's fallen to the Muslims. Now, you, Christians, need to use your rage and get it back. And it's using the rage that's so interesting. Let's see Pope Urban. Here he is, a statue. You can imagine Pope Urban II. Let's just look at that speech. This is the version from Robert the Monk. An accursed race. Here's where the inherent racism of these crusades, although we should be careful about that term in the Middle Ages. An accursed race, a race utterly alienated from God, has invaded the lands of those Christians and has depopulated them by the sword, pillage, and fire. He moves from the abstract, by the way, to the very concrete. If he's trying to get anger, it's difficult to be angry about abstract things, isn't it? Somebody has done terrible things. No, remember, for Aristotle, we need something more specific, don't we? We need something more that sticks in the mind. And Urban, I think, instinctively knows this as he continues. They circumcised the Christians, can you imagine? And the blood of the circumcision they either spread upon the altars or pour into the vases of the baptismal font. Now, this is much better, isn't it? You can really picture, well, it's not nice to picture it. He's giving you more imagery something more concrete to get angry about. You have children. Would you like them to be forcibly circumcised and the blood to drain into a baptismal font? It gets even more specific, even more graphic. When they wish to torture people by a base death, they perforate their navels and, dragging forth the extremity of the intestines, bind it to a stake. Others they bind to a post and pierce with arrows. This could all be the imagination of Robert the Monk, I just want to point out. But still, in this version, right, you see what's happening. You know, build up the emotions, build up the investment, build up the anger.
He's so tricky with his statements, I guess.
Yeah, possibly. What shall I say of the abominable rape of the women? To speak of it is worse than to be silent. Okay, he saves that bombshell for last. And then finally, who will avenge these wrongs and recover this territory, if not you? You know, it's a pretty big burden, isn't it? You know, but this is the account, right? This is how it begins. Urban gathers, big group, accuses them that they've been wrong in the wrong way. Now they should be wrong in the right way. And by several accounts, I think Robert the Monk has this account, the people spontaneously start shouting, Deus vult, God wills it, God wills it, God wills it. It's this spontaneous frenzy is one way that it's described. That's quite uncomfortable for a lot of readers. It's quite uncomfortable for me to think that this... I don't know why. Am I more comforted to imagine that the crusade begins as a calculated act? Well, Jerusalem needs taking back. Let's plan a strategy. Instead, it's presented, at least in these accounts, as this collective mob, you know, upsurge. You know, like we want to take back Jerusalem. It's kind of disturbing to me. The first thing that happens, it's even more disturbing, is this spontaneous enthusiasm goes beyond the aristocracy and the landholders that it's originally presented to. So the way we hear the story is it's Urban II telling all the knights and all the barons, stop fighting each other, fight crusade. There's popular enthusiasm straight away. By all account, thousands of people, ordinary people like us, want to join the crusade. There's a promise, by the way, that Urban makes, which is if you go on crusade, there's remission for your sins. You know, as people studying sin, you know, obviously that speaks to us, right? We can understand why that's so attractive. So wash away all your sins by going on crusade. So maybe this is the reason it's attractive. Maybe people, I don't know. It's a big debate among historians. Why did so many people want to go and fight for Jerusalem? Why do people want to fight Muslim people in the Levant? You know, and there's several theories. One theory is that, well, life was pretty devastated for a lot of people. The population was growing. There are a lot of young men, particularly, who aren't employed. They don't have land. This is an opportunity. Well, for what? I don't know, an opportunity to do something else, or an opportunity to get new land. There's like a whole colonial thesis of the Crusades, which is, you know, these people are going off on crusade with gaining some territory in mind, with subjugating other people and gaining their own colony in mind. I think it doesn't really stack up with the evidence for lots of reasons. It looks like people lost a lot of money in the Crusades. It costs more to do it. Like if you really were so desperate and short of cash, you're going to stake everything on this. You're going to sell everything you own to buy the equipment you need and then never see your family again, probably, to go on this risky mission to possibly get a small plot of land in Syria. It seems a little bit tenuous. Maybe we just have to accept that people were excited by the prospect of fighting for Jerusalem. I don't know. But anyway, this is the popular response. Poor Peter the Hermit. Well, not poor Peter the Hermit, poor the people in the People's Crusade. This is a group of, as I say, ordinary people who follow this very charismatic man called Peter the Hermit, who they say, one account says he's almost godlike, like he's so charismatic. People just are willing to follow him. He seems to be holier than anyone else. So he gets this huge following, thousands of people, men, women, and children of a certain age join this guy. They take a route across Europe. I mean, it's a massively ambitious thing. This is before the official crusade has started. Like, the official crusade has not begun. None of the big guys have got all their money together yet. But the People's Crusade begins. They move from the Rhineland and from the Low Countries, and they go through Bohemia and down to Constantinople. And then it's just a horror story, really. It just, this is a modern depiction, as you can see, of the later Crusaders just encountering all these skeletons on the road. It's like, This was the People's Crusade. There's a lot of destruction and slaughter. This is not a military strategy. There's not much in the way, from what we gather, of coordination. It's a real disaster. It's a real human tragedy. Many people also end up in slavery as well in Asia Minor. Poor People's Crusade. It's not the last time we have one of these. There's also the Children's Crusade, but we won't talk about that. You can Google it. It's a later one. So the official crusade then is ludicrously complicated and ludicrously fragmented, and we just do not have time in this session to talk about it in all the detail it deserves. There are some wonderful accounts. Thomas Asbridge is probably the best. Stephen Runciman is the old classic account where everyone's a villain and everyone's out for their own interests. Chris McKevitt, Rough Tolerance. There's some wonderful books that you can read on the Crusades, so I don't need to do it all for you, but I will just spell out some basics. And one of the basics is you have 4 major armies led by 4 nobles. I'll leave you guessing as to which of them eventually becomes the king of Jerusalem. But we have Raymond of Toulouse, Robert of Flanders, Godfrey of Bouillon, and Bohemond of Tarantolo. Here's Godfrey of Bouillon. Here becomes one of the 9 worthies, a real Christian warrior hero. And they take these routes across Europe. You can imagine the amount of organisation and planning these things take. As you can see, some of them choose to go down through Italy to Brindisi and then go over from there through Greece. Some choose to go right the way down this route. I was speaking to Tom Ash recently, who drove from Chmin to Poland. So I imagine he'd have some insight about these kinds of routes and what they're like now. You can imagine how complicated it is, though, and what a commitment it is. Are you really going to come back if you go this far? The first port of call is Constantinople, and it's kind of a tricky relationship. I mentioned earlier that there was a split and a schism. Obviously, we're now in Russia, which is part of the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church, however you want to call it. True Christianity, I don't know what you call it. But this schism began in 1054, where you have this split. And so no longer is there this dialogue. By the time of the First Crusade, there's not this dialogue between Constantinople and Rome really anymore. They're kind of their own things. There's a lot of an appeal, and they both can respect that they're both Christians. They're both part of the same church at a broader level, and there is correspondence. And Pope Urban says the crusade is to help their fellow Christians, the Eastern Christians. So it's not like they're enemies, but it's tricky. And in Constantinople, which is this magnificent city, I think always it feels like the Crusaders who come from Western Europe are totally outclassed when they arrive in Constantinople. Like they look like just, who is this ragtag assortment of barbarians, is the way it would be seen. They're not refined in the ways that their counterparts in Constantinople would be. At the head of all this is the tricksy, as he's described in the sources, Emperor Alexius Comnenus, Alexius I. He's the emperor of the East. He's the emperor who's in Constantinople. And it's quite complicated. What does he do? Here are all these armies who've come from the West, all angry. Deus Vult, God wills it, we will avenge Jerusalem for Christianity. And yet, what do we do? How do we channel this? Alexius is in the East. He's playing his own game. He has his own diplomatic and military missions to make. It's a little bit awkward, to be honest with you. Now, just from our point of view of anger, it's quite interesting how the sources already start to paint Alexius, the Western sources paint Alexius as precisely being someone given to precisely the kind of wrong anger, bad anger, evil, manipulative anger. And so we get this description, which is really unfair, of Alexius. The evil emperor, when he heard this, was exceedingly angry, going beyond. The emperor, in anxious and fervid rage, was pondering some way by which he might seize these knights of Christ by fraud. Fervid rage. These kind of descriptors are interesting in themselves. Just shows us the level of hostility between the Western and Eastern Christians just emerging there. Look, for the story of the Crusades, it's complicated. They all eventually agree that they'll bow down and make an oath to Alexius, actually I should say. The Crusaders get down and they make an oath. All of them, some of them are reluctant. They agree that if they capture Jerusalem, any lands they capture that used to belong to the emperor, they will give back to Alexius. Obviously, the reason I'm mentioning is because they're not going to, and that is, of course, what happens. Massive betrayal on the part of the Western Christians. Oh, there's a lot more to talk about. They all get stuck in the deserts of southern Turkey. They all end up being so thirsty they have to drink their horse's blood. There's some terrible stories along the way. People go on skirmishes, get massacred. It's not an easy journey by any means. Let's skip to Antioch, because this is where we can see some interesting tensions, particularly in terms of anger and righteous violence. Here's a modern reconstruction of what this city of Antioch, which is in Asia Minor, what Antioch would have looked like at the time. This is where this massive and traumatic battle takes place between Christian and Islamic soldiers, right, in the Crusade. And it's a siege. So what happens is the Christians first take the city of Antioch, right, the Western Christians. Their armies manage to succeed in piercing the walls, fighting off everyone inside and taking this city. But then disaster, because they're surrounded and they're trapped in the walls of the city. And it's this huge siege between the two, right, between the Saracens and the Christians. And basically the Muslims all cut off all of the supply chain. So they start to slowly starve to death, and they have no water and all sorts of problems inside the city. And this causes massive tension and unrest, and it lasts for ages. And they pray and pray and pray. The Christians pray and pray and pray that something will come up. They've been surrounded, there's no way out, that there's going to be no choice but to just like desperately stream out of the city and try and fight the army. But they're outnumbered massively by the Muslim forces. The Saracens are way higher in number, and it's all going to go wrong. And then this bizarre thing happens. Before this, by the way, I should say, we hear in the sources of a premonition, which shows us something about anger. This is made to Kabara by his mother, apparently. This is recorded in the Gesta Francorum. It tells us more about Christian ideas of anger than it does Muslim, but apparently Kabara's mother says to her son, she says, "You're going to die. You're going to die because I see it in a vision. You're not going to die now in this battle, but nevertheless you will die this year, because God does not, with quick anger, immediately judge him who has offended him, but when he wills it, he punishes with manifest vengeance." If you like, this is like a Christian fantasy justifying why Kabara should die, right? Because he's going to be the victim of God's anger. So, you know, imagine a mother telling her son this. I can't even picture what tone she uses. You're going to die, and it seems so detached, doesn't it? But notice that distinction in God's anger. It's not going to be quick anger. That's not how God works. He's not choleric. He doesn't have a temper. He has manifest vengeance. It's a bit like that tension we said earlier, between like, does God get angry, or do things just, are they actions that we interpret as anger, but really they're just the manifest vengeance? And I think that's the distinction here. Anyway, so apparently these are the visions that are taking place. What really happens, it's this bizarre story. It's this unbelievable story. The Christians are starving to death. They're drinking their horse's blood again. They're never going to get out. And then apparently this guy called Peter Bartholomew has a dream. He has a dream. In the dream, he sees this thing, this golden-tipped thing here, the lance that was apparently, is a holy relic, the lance that was used to pierce Christ's side on the cross, the lance that went into his side, right? It's a holy relic. Peter Bartholomew has this dream. He says, and he wakes up, I know the Holy Lance is here. It's here in Antioch. We need to dig for it, and if we dig for it, we'll win. This will be our secret weapon. It's bizarre, isn't it? So, of course, what happens is he says it's in the church. So they go to the church, and they all start digging, and they see nothing. He says, at this spot, they dig, and they see nothing. So then they can't find anything. Peter Bartholomew himself jumps down. I think I see it. And then here it is. He finds the lance. So it's a bizarre story. Now, the reason we're laughing is we think it's ludicrous, right? It's all made up. But so did medieval thinkers. So did people who witnessed it. To the extent that after this episode happened, they forced Peter Bartholomew to, I think it was a trial by fire, like where he has to hold this hot iron in his hands. And like if his skin hasn't healed up, it means he's guilty of making this stuff up. And he was actually found guilty, but then he died from the wounds, from the... It's terrible. Anyway, so we're skeptical, so were they. They're not idiots. This is a tall story. But anyway, they're skeptical, but they still go along with it in the moment. They take this lance into battle. Here it is, apparently a depiction of it being held up here, the Holy Lance, and it works. It works, guys. It works. The Saracens are driven out. They're massively outnumbered, but the Christians storm out in a frenzy out of the city walls. They kind of manipulate the timings as well, so they get the perfect moment. But they overwhelm them. They believe it's because the Holy Lance has helped them. It's interesting to reflect on this. On the surface level, it's quite simple. This is obviously divine vengeance because it's a holy relic they're using. They believe themselves to be performing divine vengeance. Look, it's a weapon that they're using as a weapon, which is supposedly holy. It's a perfect embodiment of justifiable violence or something like that. It's also tenuous though, isn't it? As Peter Bartholomew's trial shows us, not everyone's comfortable with this process. They might be comfortable with winning. They might not be comfortable with winning and lying about how they're doing it. Anyway, huge success. It's the biggest blockbuster in the Crusades history in terms of a great victory for the Western Christians. And it's never forgotten. And they write songs about it. They write poems about it, chronicles, endless stuff. It's a heroic moment. Come to Jerusalem. They've won before when they're surrounded and where they have no hope about overcoming the enemy. Jerusalem's an interesting case because it's actually an example of trickery and siege machines. It involves some secret bargain being struck with people who are guarding the city walls. We see in these depictions, actually they use these enormous siege machines. They build these huge scaffolds on wheels that they push towards the walls, and they use these to undermine the walls and so on. It's a complicated process. But they succeed. The interesting thing here, in terms of anger, is again, there's this ritual. You can't just perform sacred violence in these crusades, it seems. There has to be some ritual that happens first that makes it sacred. So, for example, the lance, the ritual of finding the lance kind of makes it okay to just be slaughtering everyone the next day. We have the same process in Jerusalem. And there's this description, right, that God is angry. And this is from the account of Raymond here. The Lord sent word to us through the Bishop of Puy, Lord Adhemois, how he could placate his anger and obtain his mercy. God is angry, and you can placate that anger if you do this. And it is, purge yourselves of your uncleanliness, and let each one turn from his evil ways. Then with bare feet march around Jerusalem, invoking God, and you must also fast. So they perform this ritual, they do this sort of penance march around the city in prayer, and then this is what gives them the strength to make the final push. So once again, there's two kinds of things going on here with anger. On the one hand, of course, God is angry and it needs avenging. But on the other hand, it kind of seems to be this, as I say, this process where the anger is justified, the rage, and believe me, there was rage. Within the city walls, the descriptions are blood everywhere, blood up to the ankles, blood up to the knees. The rage comes, and it's indiscriminate, and it's terrible when they're inside the city. But first we have that penance, first we have that purification. Sacred violence, sacred anger, let's frame it as sacred by putting it within a context of prayer and penance and fasting. This is going to be a short lecture, by the way. We're not that far away from finishing. The Second Crusade. The Second Crusade, I'm not going to talk about much, except that we're going to meet an old character again. So the First Crusade ends, right? The Christians take Jerusalem. There is now a kingdom of Jerusalem, right? It's a Latin Christian colony, and it remains for 90-odd years, okay, in Latin Christian hands. We have a king of Jerusalem, it's an interesting example of what they call sort of, I suppose, well, Chris McEvock calls it rough tolerance, that actually, and he's a historian, actually what's interesting is once you have that kingdom of Jerusalem, everyone, they get on. It's not like there's this perpetual anger and hatred of one another, Christians and Muslims, and Jews too. Actually, there's this rough tolerance. People, get angry with one another in a small way, but there's not this sustained, angry hatred, vengeance, feud, bitterness. It seems not to happen. It's refreshing to read about. So there's a Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. Every other crusade fails to recapture and retake Jerusalem, by the way. Every other crusade is manifestly considered to be a failure, with some minor successes. So we never get those heights again for the Western Christians. The Second Crusade in 1146, when different lands have fallen again to Muslim forces, notably Edessa. Let's go to Vézelay here in France. And this one's slightly shocking, again, when it comes to thinking about anger and how it's channeled, holy anger. Who do we see again on this spot in the year 1146? Who comes to preach the crusade? What figure could be less suited, but also more suited to telling you to channel your inner emotions, keep them, but turn them to the right place? You might remember the story of this figure, Bernard of Clairvaux, and his own lust, which he says, retain your lust, but turn it to the right direction. Bernard becomes the figure who preaches the Second Crusade most vigorously, which is surprising, as we often associate Bernard with love and, a transcending of the world through love of God. Well, he also preaches this channeling your own anger towards the reasons, for the purposes of God too. This is the spot in Vézelay, incidentally, where Bernard preached the Second Crusade. And let's look at what he said. This is in March 1146. And it's astonishing that these words come from the same mouth that preached his sermons on the Song of Songs, the same mouth that talked about dissolving yourself in love into God. O ye who listen to me, hasten then to appease the anger of heaven. Again, the generalized abstract anger of heaven, but then more specific. Fly then to arms. Let a holy anger animate you in the fight, and let the Christian world resound with these words of the prophet. Cursed be he who does not stain his sword with blood. Oh dear. What do you think, guys? Has Bernard gone beyond the bounds? Remember Judith with Holofernes, that look on her face. It's like, is she enjoying it too much? Is Bernard enjoying this too much? At any rate, you can see there, this is anger. This is anger. He wants you to be angry. He wants people to not just fight and do it. Like, you remember some of those Judith pictures where she's just smiling as she cuts off the head. That's not what Bernard's asking for, is it? Bernard's asking for a ruthless and furious commitment to the Christian cause. Animate you, a holy anger animates you in the fight. He wants you to be animated by the anger, not just do it, but feel it too. And cursed be he who does not stain his sword with blood. Oh my goodness. I'm imagining if I were involved in these crusades, I'd be hoping to get away with, maybe just getting a small injury early on and having to go home without ever hurting anyone. That's not what Bernard wants. I would be damned for that. He wants me to actually get blood on my sword. I can just imagine hearing those words and wondering how I could get out of it. Sounds bad, doesn't it? But yeah, that's what they want. They want actual anger, ruthless bloodshed. They don't just want you to, throw something from a distance. You need to be in the fight for Bernard. Now, by the way, just quickly, if you are wondering, what did Muslim writers and thinkers think of all of this? What's their response? It's a good question. There are many sources that describe this. I've just chosen one because I like the description. It is a little early, so it's not specifically referring to the Crusades, but it is referring to the encounter with violent Christians. The power of the sun is weak among them because of their distance from it. Cold and damp prevail in their regions, and snow and ice follow one another in endless succession. I feel like this, obviously, about some places that I wasn't familiar with and that I am now. The warm humour is lacking among them. I don't feel this. Their bodies are large, their nature's gross, their manners harsh, their understanding dull, and their tongues heavy. Okay, I definitely don't feel these things. But it's just interesting to see this sort of prejudice from this side. And this is actually how a lot of things are processed. That, Christians can make all of these claims about divine anger and knowing the difference between a justifiable and a not justifiable rage. But of course, understandably, to Muslim writers, it just appears like blind fury, barbarous greed. This is a debate that we could have if we were reading other historians. But what were the motives? Behind all of this rhetoric, like you've got to get your sword bloody and you've got to do all these things, you've got to have holy anger animating you. Well, what were the motives of the average crusader? We just don't know. There are some testaments, but it's obviously open for debate. Did everyone feel that divine rage? Were many people doing it because they were frightened? Third Crusade can be really brief here. This is the big one. This is the other blockbuster crusade, the famous one, the battle between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. It's often called the King's Crusade because there were so many kings involved. Again, it starts, I just point this out because it's so weird at the beginning. Again, it starts with this plea to direct your anger against the enemy. Aid the strength of your suffering mother, remember her breasts, with whose milk the primitive church of Jerusalem was nourished. Awkward metaphor, maybe, but a common one in this period. Put on the cross in remission of your sins, be proud of yourselves as servants of the cross, and avenge the shame of the cross. Not as strong as Urban II, but it's still there. That you should feel something, you should avenge. It's called the King's Crusade because a lot of kings are involved in it, notably Philip II of France. Frederick Barbarossa actually dies on this crusade crossing a river, and it's really terrible actually. He's quite old at this point. He's crossing a river, the armour's very heavy, he drowns. He hasn't got all the way to the Holy Land, and everyone just turns around and goes home because it's too awful. It's just too awful. Well, it's serious as well. It's not just that they're scared. They're also wondering, God, what's going to happen back in Germany now? Barbarossa's dead. It's going to be civil war. We all need to go home. Otherwise, we'll all lose all our land. Saladin here. There are so many stories about Saladin. The juxtaposition works quite well here. Saladin depicted as the noble ruler, the more peaceable, the more modern figure, the figure that we can empathise with. He's not so unreasonable. Whereas someone like Richard the Lionheart, the king up here, the English king in this crusade, violent man, known as a Lionheart because like a lion he will roar, he's full of his rage. Saladin much more reasonable, although Saladin is also called by many Christian writers the sixth horn of Antichrist. So, again, it's the usual up and down reputation. Here's Richard battling with Saladin from a sort of history of racism point of view. I would just point out Saladin's depiction here. Blue, he's blue. His nose is like mine, actually. This is the battle between Richard and Saladin, which, of course, Richard comes out well from. The Third Crusade is strange because it's kind of fragmented, but there's this new policy. We'll go along the water, start with Cyprus, take Cyprus, and then use that as a base to attack Jerusalem. It doesn't really work. But they do end up taking Cyprus, and Richard the Lionheart takes it. Actually, it's a huge embarrassment for Richard, this crusade, because on his way back home, he gets captured in Germany and ransomed for some enormous sum. Like, the people of England have to pay something like 3 times the annual GDP or something, like some ludicrous sum in his ransom. I think it's like one of the biggest scandals in English history, but everyone's forgotten it, so it's okay. I haven't, though, and lots of people haven't. What's my point here? Here's my point. Another crusade, blah, blah, blah. But more complex, I think, problems for the question of anger. Now, I haven't deliberately talked about the biggest scandal of the Crusades, actually, which is the First Crusade, which are the pogroms in the Rhineland. These are, without question, the most disgusting part of all of the Crusades, equally as disgusting as what I'm about to show you. But this is where, right at the start of the First Crusade, there's this spontaneous decision. We're going to the Holy Land to kill the infidel, the non-faithful. Why don't we start at home and kill the Jewish population? Right here, they're on the doorstep. That would be easier. And unfortunately, it's a terrible part of the history of Europe, but there are all these massacres. I'm going to talk about that when we talk about invidia, next week, so just save that one, unfortunately. But this is equally shocking, and this is this moment. And this is where we have to think about Richard the Lionheart, the massacre of Ayadir, 20th of August, 1191. What is this event? Before we talk about this, I would point out that the statue of Richard the Lionheart still stands outside the House of Parliament in Britain, in London. Long ago, I used to think they should get rid of that statue, but part of me thinks it's okay. But of course, now it's very topical to want to remove statues. But once we listen to this event, I think you might all agree that maybe it's time to get rid of Richard's statue. The Massacre of Ayodhya. Richard is angry with a situation. The situation is that he's got this treaty with Saladin. Saladin is supposed to release some Christian prisoners, and they're supposed to agree to some ceasefire, if you like. And apparently Saladin has not kept his promise. Richard becomes, if we believe the source, extremely angry. Because the Saracens were not able to accomplish what they had sworn to do, the King of England, violently angry, led the pagan prisoners out of the city and then had 5,000 or more beheaded. He kept the greater and wealthier for those ransom he received an immense sum of money. God, it's even worse. Not only did he kill 5,000 Muslims, by the way, it's not quite 5,000, that doesn't make a difference though. The number, I suppose, it's shocking even if it was 3 or 2 or 1, isn't it? But it is in the thousands. I think it's in the 2000s. But still, he did it deliberately in front of the army, the Muslim army, so they could see this spectacle. If you go back to it, the spectacle on the scaffold. It's just too disgusting. But imagine not only doing that, but also ransoming the ones he could get money for. I mean, it's unbelievable. A central question, and this is asked by this wonderful historian of the Crusades called Stephen Spencer, who's written a book on emotions in the Crusades that we could all look at. Stephen Spencer writes, tries to identify where the anger is in this episode. Now, I don't know how we would read this episode, right? This thing here. How can you understand that without anger? There's some argument that, right, okay, Richard is just executing a policy. Richard has a policy of don't break negotiations, otherwise there are, consequences, and this is what's happening. I'm not sure what I think, but it's how do we understand this without anger? Is it worse to encounter something like this and think it's not part of anger? But notice here, violently angry. And Spencer really traces the use of these different emotional words and the associations people have with them.
I think there is some fight at the same time.
Oh, yeah.
This moment was cheerful for army.
Hopefully. Cheerful.
Yeah.
So it's difficult. I think a lot of the deadly sins, basically all the deadly sins are present here. Envy, no question. I think the obvious one is also avarice as well. Taking lust, well, maybe, who knows. I actually don't want to think about the episode anymore. It's this sort of thing that we can discuss in our seminar on anger. We can discuss how we can understand these things with the frameworks we discussed in the first lecture. Finally, this is that word that shows you that it's almost time to go. It's almost time to say goodbye. Pacifism. It wasn't all like this. Okay, so the Crusades are a complex story of different human entanglements, many of which we could code as racist, many of which we could code as avaricious, violent in all kinds of ways, bloodthirsty in all kinds of ways. We can also understand it, of course, as a religious war with a keenly felt sentiment underneath it, that people really believed that the destiny of humanity was at stake. If the world falls to Islam, then all the souls fall to hell. We could understand it in that way. It might be distasteful to us, but we could understand it in that way. Within that, obviously, we think about anger and what role it plays. Vengeful anger, which is wrong or sinful, and righteous anger, which somehow does God's will. And we always think about that tension. When is it too much? Is the whole crusade just too much? If you think that, you're not the only one. Medieval writers and thinkers and Christians of all kinds also thought this. And I just want to bring to the fore just two pacifists, or two people who thought violence was never the answer in terms of these negotiations. The first one I mentioned last week is Francis of Assisi. Unlike Bernard of Clairvaux, who was firmly on the side of turn your anger against the other, in this case, Francis just wouldn't do that. I mean, and I already told you about this last week, but of course it's Francis's encounter with the Sultan, Al-Malik al-Kamil, in 1219, where he appears and dances and performs and jokes with the Sultan. He's with the Christian armies, by the way. The Christian armies are I think it's in Damietta is where it is in Egypt. He's with them, and then he goes in, So he's part of the movement, but he's sort of demonstrating this other kind of crusade that could be possible. Go in, joke, build a bridge, form a contact. Now, look, I said last week it's possible that Francis also just wanted to be killed, that he was ready for that. He was depressed and ready to die. Depictions certainly would like us to think of something else. And I think we should at least entertain the encounter that this was another way of doing crusading, another way of doing God's work without resorting to the unspeakable violence of the Crusades, the intoxicating violence of crusading. The other pacifist, well, in this case, is Frederick II, Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. A man who, in other arenas, we might say was a violent man. He once performed an experiment on two of his servants. He got one of them to eat a massive dinner and the other one to eat nothing. And he said, right now, the two of you go out hunting. So they went out hunting, they came back in, and he killed them both and cut open their stomachs to see how much of the food had been digested. He was just curious. What a man. Is he a pacifist? Well, he was a scientist. He also did an experiment where he got, this is a terrible, never been repeated experiment, where there were two newborn babies, and he ordered for them to be isolated immediately from their mothers and brought up in isolation with no language, no speech, to see what language they would start to speak. The theory being, whichever language spontaneously these children spoke would be the language of God. Both babies, I'm afraid, did not survive. If that's, I mean, I don't want to think of it as a scientific experiment, but it teaches us that language is essential to survival. So Frederick, look, I know you're not going to like him now I've just said those two anecdotes, because I don't like him when I think of those two anecdotes. He is a character that lives beyond what we think of him. He's a character so interesting, maybe we'll return to him. He also wrote the most authoritative book on falconry, hunting with birds, that's ever been written. It's still like the most important book on falconry ever. He was obsessed. He was obsessed with the birds. He knew everything. He knew more than any human has ever known about birds, about hunting birds, falcons. You know, it's all there in the book. He illustrated it himself with his own pictures of the birds. Oh, this guy was insane. So Frederick II, what a guy, what a monster, what an enigma, what a leader. He was the last emperor that combined Italy and Germany together. And when he died in 1250, there was this myth that he would come again because he was such a legend. And some thought he was the Antichrist, and some thought he was the savior of the world. And the myth was that he was just sleeping in the mountain and that one day he would come back. One monk said he saw Frederick going into the mountain with an army of 10,000. So it must be true. But then, it gets even weirder. All of these guys kept appearing. One guy appeared in the Black Forest with a long beard and said, I am Frederick II. I did not die. I live again. And then, of course, he was an imposter. He was found out. He was burnt at the stake. And then another guy said, I didn't die on the stake. I'm Frederick still. And he was also burnt at the stake. Oh, it's the same story in Russian? Yeah, so this is all recorded by Norman Cohn in his book, The Pursuit of the Millennium. I don't believe the stories. If it's in Russian myth as well, then it must not be true, because it means that this is some common folk tale. But this is the kind of story that people would tell about Frederick II, because he was so enigmatic and kind of charismatic. And even someone like Hitler, arguably, was thinking of Frederick II, who had been the emperor of the Second Empire, and Hitler wanted to be the Third Empire, the Third Reich. So look, this is a story itself which is very complicated, and this is just by way of introducing Frederick. So now I'm going to call him a pacifist. Jesus, how can I do this? But his approach to crusading was novel. He wanted a diplomatic approach. The Fifth Crusade, I believe it is, or the Sixth Crusade rather, Frederick II with Al-Kamel, here it is. It's the bloodless crusade. It's the crusade where Frederick just made a deal. He went to Jerusalem. Why bother? Why slaughter everyone? It's too violent. Let's just make a deal. Made a deal. He had an interpreter. Frederick himself was interested in Arabic, so he was interested in learning the language. He was open. He had people who spoke it with him. So he was able to negotiate, and he walked into the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and put the imperial crown, the Kingdom of Jerusalem crown, on his own head. There's a lovely depiction of that. So that's another approach, right? So maybe he's not a pacifist totally. Maybe he does believe that violence is justified in some circumstances. But at least it shows to us a different model of what something like a crusade could be. It allows us to appreciate in a new light the anger that we do see in the Crusades. It wasn't the only option. There were other exemplars about how God's work could be done in a place like Jerusalem. Okay, guys, thank you for listening. It was a very long session today, I know, and it's very, very late. Any questions? Yeah. Here we go.
Well, what do you think, what's the reason why people went to such far land like Jerusalem? Maybe major reason.
You know, it's really hard to answer that question. Why did people go on crusade in the first place? You know, I don't believe that everyone was whipped up by righteous anger. I just don't believe it. I have to admit. I think that my interpretation is that that's an exaggeration of the sources. That's something that the sources want to present the crusade as being. You know, everyone united in their anger at the injustice which has taken place in Jerusalem. Naturally, we can't account for human motivation, can we? I mean, if we do silly things in our own lives or crazy things, we don't even know why we do them ourselves. How can we talk about thousands of people 1,000 years ago and know about their motives? But what I would say is that we should take seriously the motives of desperation, of economic impoverishment. That a lot of people, this seems like as good an option as any other. It's the famous Runciman thesis that these are dispossessed lower aristocracy who want to find new land in the east. And it does happen. One or two, like Baldwin, Bohemond, one or two, Tancred, one or two crusaders go off and form their own little colonies. Like Edessa becomes one. Such colony. Antioch becomes one such colony, which is like a private kingdom run by one of these chancellors, if you like, who goes on crusade. So that's one explanation. Some people, this was an opportunity. For some people, maybe they got swept up in a movement that they didn't really want to be on, but it seemed right. Some people may have been genuinely motivated by their own sins. Some people may have said, look, I've lived a terrible life. This is my chance to do something to stop, you know, to fight it. How can we know? We're not going to be put in that position, guys. We're not living in a society where loads of your friends are going off to war voluntarily on a perilous mission with some swords. I mean, it's just, thankfully, I think, it's not happening in our lives. It's hard for us to understand. But yeah, I think being swept up might be an answer. Any other questions? Yes. Alina.
Okay, so
it is on, apparently. We have to have faith.
yeah, so I have a general question about anger. Isn't this difference between righteous anger and fury come from New Testament and Old Testament? Because one is teaching us that doing a genocide in the name of God is cool, and the second one is saying that we should give the other cheek to our offender.
Yes. Generally speaking, that would be a pattern. You know, the Old Testament more readily justifies vengeful anger. The New Testament pretty much condemns it. You know, Jesus, of course, turned the other cheek. I would just say that the New Testament idea is difficult to practice in a political society, isn't it? It's easy to practice in a monastery, more or less. And even there, I'm sure people got tempted to not turn the other cheek. But it's difficult to take and translate these New Testament ideas into a complex political life where people do want things from you and they will take them violently. And it's not easy to say the right thing is to sit back and let it happen and turn the other cheek. Jesus says, how many times should you turn your other cheek? 6 times, 6 times, 6 times. I can't remember what he says, but it's forever, basically. Yeah, it doesn't really work in this context. So, yes, the paradigm is there, Old Testament, New Testament, and all the tensions that go with it. But people pick and choose, I see, in these sources where they justify these things. The Psalms can be used to justify the most terrible acts of violent rage and fury. People don't seem to be saying, well, Matthew says we shouldn't do anything angry, but still we're doing this. They choose to just ignore Matthew when it comes to justifying these crusades. Any other questions? Okay, thank you. I don't know how tired you are. I'm really tired. I think you probably are too. I'm going to say it one more time. This class continues when you come and find me and talk to me, all right? I'd like that conversation. It would be a pleasure for me. I'm not going to try and make an excuse and run away from you, unless I do have a good excuse, which I will. So please, the lectures are the lectures, but let's continue this class in whichever way you like in the coming days, okay?